And we are off. I am delighted to welcome you here on behalf of the Veolia Institute for our new conference. Upon publication of our new facts report on a very important theme, which is the environment, health, and climate change. And I also welcome those who are following us online. I'm sure that you have a copy of the report that you can have here in the lobby. You can also download it on our website. Health and the environment and health, obviously the two are very interdependent. One depends on the other, and deterioration of the environment is harmful for human health. And the same, when we protect the environment, we actually are protecting human health. So the links between the two themes are known for millennia. Hippocrates already said that we shouldn't build cities in places that are unhealthy. Water, the soil, the climate, the atmosphere, all of this has an impact on our organisms and on our lives from the beginning to the very end through the environment, the household environments, natural, urban environments. Our body is in contact with numerous physical agents, chemical agents, biological agents, which will have an impact on our health. And then there's the current health crisis. And could this be interpreted as a major environmental crisis impacting humans, just like pollution or the deterioration of natural resources, loss of biodiversity, and climate change? So health impacts of climate change are varied and numerous. People dying in heat waves or more recurrent epidemics, a loss of productivity of our food production, increasingly rare water resources, deterioration of mental health, especially among young people, et cetera, et cetera. So one way or another, no country can escape the consequences of climate change, to such an extent that some have said that the climate crisis is the greatest public health crisis we've ever seen. And if you take a few examples, heat waves, it kills 500,000 people every year, and this may increase by several factors over the coming decades because of this silent killer. And heat waves will be more frequent and more intense. Europe is the continent which is heating up the fastest, and there's a general increase in temperature of about 2 degrees around the planet would translate in France to an increase of 4 degrees in France on average. And we'll see 50-degree temperatures in cities over several weeks. And we'll discover what it's like to live when it's 50 degrees out. And this will also lead to increased transmission of viruses and bacteria. Today, currently, we find them in tropical and intertropical zones, dengue, chikungunya, cholera, malaria, but it will also make them increasingly active over time. Rising temperatures in waters, in lakes and oceans, has an impact on the bacteria, and there will be also increased illnesses due to waterborne diseases. Climate change will also make it easier to spread tropical diseases. In France, for example, tiger mosquitoes are already present in 78 of the French departments, and this is the vector of illnesses such as dengue, chikungunya, or Zika. And there's also the melting of the permafrost, and this could be a climate and healthcare bomb because it will release into the atmosphere huge quantities of greenhouse gases, which are trapped right now. And it will also release bacteria and viruses that have been trapped in the frozen earth for tens of thousands of years. And humanity does not have perhaps any way of becoming immune to these illnesses. The pharmaceutical products such as antibiotics will not work on them. And it's mostly low-income countries who will suffer the most from climate change because they have fewer financial resources to adapt. Adaptation is a key term, and it's a vital imperative for ecosystems and for humans. But very rapid changes in our environment don't leave much time for ecosystems to be able to adapt to changes, which leads to terrible effects on the healthcare of ecosystems and that of humans. The One Health approach, which looks at the very tight links between ecosystems, between animals and humans and ecosystems. Healthy ecosystems are good for human health. And to take a phrase from one of the authors who published in the Facts report, we're a single planet, and now we have only one health. So we need a variety of solutions. We have to persevere over decades in all countries around the world. For example, more plants in cities, low consumption buildings that retain coolness in the summer, heat in the winter, recycling wastewater, and changing our lifestyles. We have to pay particular attention to medical infrastructure. Hospitals, first and foremost, they have to be ready to receive more patients and to better monitor their water consumption because they consume a lot of water. At Veolia, we know this very well, of course. So they will also have to overhaul their cooling and heating systems because very often they were not designed for such extreme variations in temperature. For hospitals on the coasts, in areas which may be hit by cyclones, they also have to increase protection because extreme weather events will be more and more intense. Human health expresses the quality of the relationship that we have with ecosystems. And this is why if human health, which will be the ultimate judge of any success or failure in our adaptation policies to climate change. And so these are the themes that are explored in our new issue of the Veolia Institute. They look at case studies in emerging countries as well as in developed countries. It was prepared with the Westone firm, and I thank them very warmly for their work. So you can get a copy at the entrance here or on the Veolia website. There are contributions from a variety of authors, from academics from universities such as Harvard, Columbia, or the University of California, multilateral organizations such as the ILO, CNRS, INRIA, the AXA Fund for Research into Health, professors, medical specialists, epidemiologists, neurologists, and other experts in climatology, physical and material sciences working for associations or the private sector, companies such as Sanofi and AXA, and then startups as well, specializing in artificial intelligence such as Sansgrass in India. Today's conference brings together several specialists, and I thank them very warmly for being here. They will be sharing their own experience in these areas. So we'll have Cédric Baecher from Wavestone, and I will now give him the floor. Thank you very much, dear Nicolas, for this introduction. So Nicolas laid the groundwork for our discussion today, which will be fascinating. Welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for being here in the room as well as online. I think we have quite a lot of participants online, and we are delighted to have you here with us and to see how interested you are in our work. I am Cédric Baecher. I'm a partner at Wavestone, and I'm co-leader of sustainability practices. There are 300 consultants dedicated to sustainable transformation and operational challenges. So, Nicolas, thank you very much for your introduction. And I will begin this sequence by thanking the Veolia Institute. Nicolas, Daina, thank you for your trust. It's been a great honor to work with you for a year now, and with all of your teams on these topics. We've worked together before. We've worked on the quality of indoor air a few years ago. And the last time I had a conference in this auditorium, actually, COVID hit us a few months later. I hope things won't happen that badly this time. I hope that we'll be able to go and have a drink all together when we come out without having to imagine future crises, which will hit us. And on a more personal note, it's always a very great pleasure to come here at the Veolia headquarters. And dear Nicolas, Daina, we have a very shared history. It's been 25 years. When I was still a student at ESEX, and it was with Veolia that we went around the world to look at À quoi tu penses. It was an associative work. So 25 years later, it's a great pleasure to continue to look into all of these topics all together. And also with you, Nicolas, we worked on the book with UNESCO 20 years ago, and with the foundation and other stakeholders. So, yes, you are very right to have come here this morning to hear us talk about health and the environment. As Nicolas reminded us, these are very burning issues, and there's international events. Well, I'm sure you've all seen the recent reports by the APBS on biodiversity under the aegis of the UN, and which, again, tells world leaders that biodiversity and climate, water, health, food are all intricately linked, and therefore we need a global integrated approach. There's also the WHO report. Just a few weeks after the COP29 in Baku, they published a special report to ask to urgently include healthcare in negotiations around the climate. So awareness has been raised, and now we are strongly mobilized around these issues. Publishing this issue, which we've been working on for the past year, that we're presenting this morning, obviously is not there to provide all of the answers. That would be very pretentious on our parts, and it wouldn't be very realistic given the complexity of the challenges ahead of us. But it was really a way of understanding our analysis of and to decipher viewpoints. We have about 30 authors from 10 countries with very, very varied backgrounds. True interdisciplinarity, that is one of the hallmarks of our institute, and we'll come back to this in the roundtable, to trigger thoughts in your minds and amongst all of us. And I would also like to very warmly thank all of the authors who contributed to this publication and the wonderful team that worked alongside myself, Bérénice Bourgeois, Laurie Olala, Eric Despointes, and then, of course, the entire team from the Veolia Institute. Without further ado, let me introduce our panelists and invite them to join me here on the stage. And I apologize for François Gémen. Unfortunately, he was not able to join us this morning. But first, I will call upon Julia Dastorg. Welcome. You are head of the AXA Research Fund. Please have a seat. So you're in charge of scientific philanthropy at AXA, and your role is to improve understanding. Yes, you're first, so you can choose your seat. So understanding emerging risks by supporting science to inform public and private decision-making. Thank you very much for being here. You have a lot of expertise in the healthcare center. You've had several operational posts, international ones. And in previous lives, you were responsible for the health crisis response and emergency evacuations and medical innovation. So a very rich background. And then we have Sandrine Bouttier-Streff. Welcome, Sandrine. So for several years, you've been in charge of health, safety, environment at Sanofi. And you're in charge of corporate social responsibility for the group. You're in charge of global health, health equity, and resilience and adaptation to environmental risks. 20 years experience in protecting the environment and healthcare and sustainable development. So also wonderful experience to shed light on these issues and to decipher what's in this last publication. And then Philippe Seberac. So you've worked for Veolia your entire career. You are the technical and scientific director. You're in charge of performance, and you're in charge of corporate R&D with the business units and the strategic department and group innovation. Thank you very much to all of you for being here. And we have about 45 minutes for our discussion. Okay, we have too many microphones, so that's unusual. So we have 45 minutes for our exchanges. So we won't go over all of the contents of the latest report, but there are three major questions to get us started. First of all, maybe in just a few words, why, in your view, it's important to think about this nexus, this interconnection between climate, health, and the environment? Why is it important, and what is our current approach to this nexus? And then in the second part, we will look at what's holding us back and why it's so complicated to work on these topics all together rather than everyone in their own corner, depending on their the issues they're most interested in. So what are these hurdles and what can we do about it? And then we'll talk about solutions. We won't cover all the possible solutions that you will find in the review, but what the levers are that we can action and think about this interconnection. So first of all, let me cite two other authors in the review to give some background. We have Peter van Kan with a fascinating article on health. So he's a biologist, and he looks at the risks of extreme heat waves. They're 30 times more likely now in India, and it will certainly be one of the primary countries where the heat will be incompatible with life. And we have Françoise Gale, who's a biologist. She's senior specialist of the Climate Institute, and she said that the ocean is full of resources for human health and for materials. 20,000 secondary metabolites have been characterized in marine animals over the past 40 years, and we have to find how we can use these resources sustainably. So Julia, let's start with you, if we may. So what could we say? So as your role of the AXA Research Fund, what's your view of this nexus, and how can the world of research tackle these challenges, and where do we stand today? Thank you very much, Cédric, and a huge thanks to the Veolia Institute. This is a great opportunity to raise awareness about these extremely complex topics. The first, we now have the very primary climate doctors. Catastrophe medicine didn't exist 30 years ago. It wasn't a medical specialty, but today, climate medicine will now become its own specialty. So why are we interested in this? Well, very simply because the Director General of the World Health Organization himself said that the climate crisis is a health crisis. And it's true that today, I think that we can talk about these topics by incarnating them very concretely and in a grounded manner. You can't say I'm going to solve climate issues and then I will solve healthcare problems. Or, okay, now the humans are all asthmatic, they all have asthma, but to cure asthma you have to look at climate deregulation in parallel. So the two are intricately linked. And I believe that health is a very good way, a good thing to put at the center, because healthcare is very concrete and it's situations that people are living in. It's their experience. So it's a way of moving up the chain to say, okay, we have to take care of the climate because it's having a direct impact on your children's health. So AXA is an insurance company. Why are we interested in these topics? If we just take a step back for a minute, the DNA of an insurance company is to look at risks. Risks in the world, because a risk that you've understood is a risk that becomes measurable and becomes insurable. And what we can see around us is an explosion of emergent risks and actually new impacts of known risks, but we hadn't understood how systemic they were becoming. So in this interaction between climate and health, we have to talk about systemic risks. So Nicolas brilliantly exposed the One Health concept, and I believe that we're at a turning point. So based on this obsession that we have at AXA to understand risks, we have entire teams in-house. So to understand and to prevent risks, of course, to anticipate them and ensure them, of course. And from this, well, we have to go back to the source of knowledge, and this is in research laboratories. So we decided that we would set up a philanthropic research fund to assist researchers at all points in their careers, because young researchers has to be able to take risks in the areas of the climate and healthcare. There are great difficulties in funding research, but we believe that a philanthropical approach provides these possibilities for young researchers to carry out their research. We have some very concrete examples. So climate and health, we all know we've all got transmissible diseases in mind, dengue, chikungunya in France, for example. But what people aren't aware of are chronic illnesses. So we provide support for researchers looking at the imbrication between an increase in temperature and non-transmittable diseases, for example, premature babies. When heat goes up, there are more premature babies. So they're smaller babies and they have more healthcare problems. And it's riskier for mothers as well. The same thing is true when it's hotter. People don't sleep as well. There's a high percentage of risks to have cardiovascular troubles. So that's vastly increased. So in our research and the projects that we support, we really try to provide support for researchers who are taking risks and who are really ready to look at these issues. We could spend hours talking about it. We've already supported 700 projects in 40 countries, 400 academic institutions, and all of these researchers are now part of a network. And science is magic for this because we're not in silos. Researchers spend all of their time exchanging information and speaking to each other, and I think they are really the front runners of this fight and then in this nexus.
Thank you. Philippe, just to continue to talk about why and why it's important to think of these interfaces and go further. Climate, health, environment is also a question of access of populations to essential services. Well, the climate has a negative impact on infrastructure. Drinking water and sanitation are crucial elements for health. For industrialized society, we don't see this anymore. We don't think about these issues anymore, but they are essential, they're crucial. And in some episodes, be it extreme water shortages or storms, there's droughts, and there's also the matter of too much water. Storms, flooding. So we've had to set up backup water services in France and Belgium. So there are subjects that we knew of in equatorial countries or countries that have water stress, but we find water stress in Europe and the US, new geographical vulnerabilities. There are also issues we don't think about much. When there's floods, water quality goes down extremely fast. And we need to rethink our water treatment plants because, how can I put this? All the pollution focuses itself there, and the water treatment plants aren't equipped to manage this. There's an issue with this. Insurance issues. Are we insured for these risks? And to be insurable, I mean, Julia, correct me if I'm wrong, of course, it needs to be a risk and not a certainty. But some resources are sustainably polluted and can no longer be used. There's another surprising fact. In Australia, as you know, under COVID, there were bushfires which were horrifying. I was there. It was quite incredible. These forest fires modified the quality of the water of the Sydney water plants sustainably. Instead of organic moisture coming from plants and leaves and trees and so forth, there's a lot of ashes to work with. So they needed to reorganize how they worked, how they functioned. These are very concrete matters. There's another thing we don't think about much, temperature. Pathogens are developing, and in most networks it'll be difficult to stick to the regulatory 25 degrees for drinking water, and the chlorine doses go up mechanically. So nowadays we're trying to get balance between the treatment of these pathogens and disinfection products that have a negative impact on health, a very concrete impact in what we do. In our group, we're faced with these issues. We need to talk about these examples because that's a very stance of a facts reviews to draw a bridge between research, upstream work, and concrete impacts on our businesses, our services, our technologies, people's life and populations. Now, Sandrine, could we have your perspective on why it's important to think of these interactions between health and the environment? Maybe you could share something on this? I'd like to start by thanking the Veolia Institute, we talk a lot about climate and health, and I like this link, climate, health, and environment. And what Philippe said is very important. So climate change is going to worsen lots of topics. We've talked about infectious disease, cardiovascular health. We talked about the link between climate increase and diabetes. It's a reality. Research is very important, as is acquiring new data. There's also correlation between climate, disease, and the living conditions of populations. We had a rather surprising study, or at least in its conclusion, it's Sanofi, yes, with academics. I don't know if it was Sanofi, but its conclusions were quite surprising. We've got these preconceived ideas, and when you see a real correlation with real data, it's quite disturbing. So what I mean is we talk about the environment, but we haven't talked about air pollution yet. Air pollution is a dramatic issue. It's worsened by climate change, but breathing disease and chronic disease and infectious breathing diseases are major issues of public health for the future because of the evolutions in the climate and the environment. So we need to think data is important. Health systems must prepare as well. Health systems nowadays are faced with these issues. We're in France today. We see this in France today when there's a heat wave. We're not ready in our hospitals. Our hospitals aren't prepared to welcome a large number of patients, well, more than usual anyway, and the temperature increases that we saw in some relatively warm countries. Hospitals need to cool down more to treat the clients for energy, electricity, use of electricity, the cooling chain. The medical institutions suffer, and at the same time there's more patients. That's a real issue. It's the case in lots of countries. Nicolas talked about Europe, which is more solicited than usual because of climate change. There was a heat wave as planned, and authorities do prepare for heat waves to adapt and remediate the issues. We overcame the crises, and the plans are just shelved somewhere, and we don't do a thing. And then something happens. We thought, oh, we should have activated it. There's a real issue with this. We talk about health systems, both local territories, territorial, international plans. Now, I'd like to thank you for your work, actually, with this review. It's part of a wake-up call we need. And what's interesting is it associates academics, industrialists, scientists. For us, this is a very important subject, and it's a subject for the future. The idea is not to have patients. The idea is to have people who aren't ill. How we're going to prevent this, how we're going to adapt and ensure the resilience of patients and health systems. There's an impact of the environment on health system. But what about the impact of health systems on the environment? We talked about this a lot in the COP in Dubai, and it struck me, that's where we talked about this issue. Yes, health systems worldwide represent about 5% of global emissions. 5% doesn't look like much, but it's a lot. Is it more than air transport? It's twice the amount air transport emits, but air transport is getting better. In this 5%, about half of it, 2.5%, is what we call the supply chain. It's not just drugs being bought in. It's meals being bought into the hospital, medical equipment, X-rays, and so forth. It's about 50% supply. Clinical studies, which are very important, also represents 5%. It's not much, but there are very easy levers to activate right now to reduce. And there's also the care of a patient, both detection, treatment, managing any secondary effects of a treatment, and then monitoring. All that is about 45% of the emissions. So we need to transform how we care. We need to educate health professionals. We can illustrate this with several anecdotes in the future. Moreover, patients need to change their behaviors. They need educating. Julia, you talked about training scientists and doctors and so forth. There are actually universities that focus on the issue between climate and health and training all the actors of health systems. So that means we need a very wide vision of all the actors, not this or that. No. In a wider sense, we need to widen it with hospitals, the associations we work with, insurance companies, NGOs too, or care providers. So people who care for patients. There are many actors, the WHO, UNICEF. We are working with all these people. We've got public-private partnerships that allow us to pick up the pace on this. It's a wake-up call. We need to go beyond talking about it. We know there's an issue. Now we need to do something. The idea is to implement tools and standards, and we need to know what we're going to act on. And to know what we're going to act on, we need to measure. We need to understand what's going on to act. I just like to butt in. I'm sitting up between Philippe and Sandrine. We talked about dengue fever, which is very present in our hospitals. And actually, our medical teams aren't trained. If we draw a bridge with water, well, dengue is mosquitoes. We need to understand the mosquito's life cycle. So we've got researchers working on a mosquito's life. And it looks rather secondary, but it's very concrete because it's a vector that's developing. We've talked about this. It can sound strange. Yes, says Philippe. We were looking at the matters of a genome and the manipulation of a genome or non-manipulation of a genome. It's a very ethical matter, actually. And nowadays, people are manipulating the mosquito genome to make sure that the male-female ratio no longer is what it was. But it's a problem because mosquitoes do transmit disease, yes, but they are pollinators too. So we worked on antibiotic resistance. Do we need to modify the genome of some living organisms? And the modification of pathogens with their exposure to antibiotics. Now, Sandrine will correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks far more serious a matter of the manipulations we do, but it is an issue. We've worked with lots of actors on monitoring epidemics due to wastewater issues. It's a complicated subject, and it's got many ethical implications, monitoring the population and protecting the populations and so forth. Yes, that's why we support the first global dengue observatory in London University. We want to predict and prevent a dengue epidemic. This allows us to set up very concrete strategies to fight mosquito existence. This means that these populations don't become patients in our hospitals. So there is something there. Scientists talk about this a lot, but they're ahead of us. How can they tell us this? We need to pass on this knowledge. You all showed why this was important and why you touch upon these subjects. So maybe we could talk about the obstacles or hurdles. Same exercise. I'm going to quote two extracts from our publications. So Harvey Feinberg, who's at the head of the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, says, people still doubt of the reality of climate change. This is a crucial challenge, and why is science worthy of science? Even if things aren't certain, this is complicated. So Francis Gémen, he works for the IPCC. He wrote the last report. The main hurdle is the separate treatment of the issues of climate, health, and migration. They're treated two by two: climate and health, migration and health. And migration and climate, we need to treat all three together in a triangle. Now, Sandrine, we know there's a lot that's been done so far. What is slowing down the emergence of a rolling out of collective response? And as we talk about hurdles, what disparities do you see in the levels of preparation, of understanding of this relationship between health, the climate, and the environment? I think that the first hurdle is a lack of data, real data for forecasts. You just talked about dengue fever. Nowadays, we see forecasts on allergies, pollen allergies. Nowadays, more and more people are allergic to pollen. So we are, preparing for this, but there's also the matter of urban planning and early warning systems for people to be able to prepare, hospitals to be prepared, and all infrastructures to prepare. So the lack of real data nowadays, we're basing ourselves on observations, but we see what's happening concretely. And as I said earlier, why is going to help us, understanding why is going to help us find solutions. Then, collective intelligence. No, not collective intelligence. No, the power of working together is crucial locally, territorially, nationally, and internationally. There's an organization called PATACH with more than 80 countries for the decarboning of health systems and their resilience. We've got lots of actors from the health systems, lots of governments, and there's this collective that's been created to give a wake-up call. Hurdles, lack of funding. We say, we know what we need to do, but I don't have the funds to do this. There's lots of international foundations that are reallocating philanthropic funds to research to help with the resilience of infrastructures. And another point that needs to be looked at, it can't be underestimated, it's the regulatory issues and the cultural issues. Yes, because a collective can be an enabler, but it can also be an obstacle. And it's this matter of planning and public policies, public health policies. It must be rolled out both internationally, nationally, locally, and territorially. And in some countries, people don't really want to make use of healthcare. Vaccination, we've heard about anti-vax a lot, but vaccination is the solution. But we need to make people understand that when it's hot, they can get ill. Culturally, that's something we find very difficult to hear, and it really is something that's an obstacle. We need to find the right way to pass on the information. So some governments in some countries hadn't understood that this was an issue. It really is an obstacle because there's no real policy on this. And cultural obstacles. You talked about this home-based diabetes treatment system, which never made it. Well, no, not yet. We carried out studies on the role of digital tools in patient monitoring. What we called self-care at home, so that the patient not need to go to the doctor, and also to reduce the carbon footprint, climate footprint, and also for it to be more comfortable for the patient. It's not a matter of the environment. We look at the social, societal impact and what it does for the patient. So it's a win-win solution. We looked at several countries in different continents, and in one of the countries we saw that through via digital solution, there were less people who went to the doctor. In one country, diabetic people need to go to the doctor 6 times a year, 12 times a year, or 6 times per month to do the monitoring, to do this diabetic tests. And thanks to this tool, we can actually reduce the carbon footprint of the care. We need to accept this, but the local health authorities don't want to change things, and they want to keep this regular visit to the doctor. There's local cultural hurdles and government hurdles too. We need to explain, we need to find data to objectivate things. Okay, we're going to look at regulations. We're faced with these issues. Regulations are thought of as stable worlds, and the world no longer is stable, and people's awareness moves forwards faster than regulation. So there's this discrepancy. So planning is a real issue. And lots of states are, well, finding it difficult to manage this huge amount of problems, and they find it difficult to tackle the problems. Another example, if I may. I remember a conversation with a famous doctor from a Sydney hospital who said, we looked at all this possibility of doing less blood tests. When you have a blood test, I think there are 50 or 60 criteria that are looked at. That's for Australia. Three of them interest me. And the impact of his blood test is huge. We hadn't anticipated this. So we need to change people's mindsets. What do we really need? Do we need to do that much? And it generates savings in the health system. So it's frugality. There's a matter of change and steering towards change.
So I understand, okay, regulations are, you agree with Sandrine on this, but you see other hurdles, you have other experience in how networks or infrastructure are calibrated, whether they're prepared or not. Well, one of the greatest hurdles is materialization of risks. If you have a major flood, and you have mobile units to process water, etc. But then everybody goes home. They said, that went pretty well. And then you wait for the next one. People say, okay, well, it's very expensive to take preventive measures. And so how do you anticipate and how do you calculate the probability of a risk? Science isn't very tangible for ordinary citizens, despite all of our best efforts. And the notion of risk, well, this is a nightmare. You say, okay, this is the probability. Okay, here is the chances. Only actuaries understand things like that. So to be able to monetize solutions as compared to risk, it's extremely difficult. So every once in a while, we're able to manage. We have collectives who have put us in charge of protecting riverbanks to prevent flooding, etc. We carried out a lot of work in France with BRGM to take preventive measures to prevent droughts and to store water in the winter for irrigation in the summer. We didn't find a business model because elected officials, everybody said, well, but we're not sure it's going to be useful because they have no idea of how grave the situation is. To come back to Australia, a country that I like very much, the desalination plants. This is an incredible story. Everything was ready, everything was prepared, and then suddenly it started raining, and the reservoir goes from 25% to 75%, and then they just bury the project. But then the drought comes back, and they thought, oh, actually, it was this a really good idea, and then they start all over, and then it rains again, so they drop it. Yeah, so a very positive image of human societies and our leaders. But it's actually understandable. It's very complicated to take the risk. Just the story of masks and all of that, we won't go back into it. But normally, okay, you prepare for a crisis, and then the crisis doesn't happen. Everybody accuses you of being wasteful. It can be very hard to bring people to make decisions. That's why we need collective decisions. We've taken some initiatives, especially with the electricity producer in France, to work on major rivers. So there's an alternation between very strong flooding and droughts. People think that in 2050 we may have be able to cross the upper Rhone by foot. So how do we have enough water for industry, for people, all the time? And the water, and how do we also prevent having too much water? And how do we make sure that the regulation will allow us to take necessary measures? There's always the question of pioneers. Who's going to take those risks? So these are old problems. Preventing flooding in Paris in 1912, they built an entire system, and the system works very well. And this is infrastructure, okay, that costs a lot, but it's now become normal. But once again, the paradigm is changing, and we have to be able to tackle the question rationally. So a very quick question. In some emerging countries, are they more aware, perhaps, than others on this nexus? Well, we work best with Africa currently because they are directly exposed to infectious diseases, so doctors from Kenya, from elsewhere, and they're way ahead of us, even though they have very little means, but they have a very clear knowledge of the topic. Thank you very much. Yes, I completely agree with Philippe. People talk a lot about eco-anxiety and mental health. People are afraid of climate change. In Europe, it can be theoretical, unless, well, you're in northern France and you're being flooded. We have researchers working on mental health of people who are on the front lines, who can see the water rising, who know that their house is going to disappear, who know that things are in movement underway, that things are already underway. We're working with people in the Philippines, for example, and eco-anxiety, this isn't a minor topic. These are people who really are going to lose everything and are going to be forced to migrate. And we absolutely need to better qualify these topics and to go back to the source of knowledge and facts. And this brings us back to data, as Sandrine said. So among the hurdles, there's regulatory hurdles, also financing hurdles. And in an earlier discussion, you also talked about people's relation to science and this era of post-truth. Is this another hurdle that's preventing us from doing what needs to be done because there's a mistrust of advances in science? Well, if you explain things, people do understand. We've worked with a lot of doctors, and when you talk about risks, this lowers a preoccupation, which is that people aren't telling us the truth. But you have to be very solid. When you're working with doctors, we were talking about micropollutants and birth defects. It's difficult, but we had presentations to parliamentarians, to NGOs, and unanimously they say, at least you told us the truth. Now we know what the risks are. But then to move on to the next step, and then of course there's fake news and deep fakes, which can also disrupt things. Well, I have an example. So this isn't limited to climate and health, but currently you see that with the major emerging problems, and we see this with the AXA Research Fund, we're in contact with people on the ground, and what they tell us is that a major problem that isn't always perceived in the corporate universe that we're used to, this is the direct threat to science. Talking about data is great, but you need scientists to work on the data. So I've identified 3 major threats around science, and we have to promote and defend science. The first major threat is funding. There's a collapse in both public and private funding and in philanthropical funding. So there's a collapse. So with the new U.S. president who has said he's going to be leaving the WHO, this means fewer researchers. In France, and it's in a specific, so there will be 630 million euros less in the budget. So athletes actually are much more at the forefront than research. Because the trouble with research is that it takes a lot of time. So we can't do away with entire topics just because there's not enough funding. So how can we fund research for the very long term? We're doing what we can, but everybody else has to jump on board. It's become urgent to find sustainable sources for funding. And the second threat to science, okay, there is disinformation, post-truth. We're being bombarded by fake news. And people tend to believe their neighbor more than a scientist. Because sometimes the scientists are very far away, they're in research labs, we have to bring them out into the open. How can we ensure that we have people who transmit this knowledge, who can create opportunities for people to come and speak to us? And in this review, So we had 3 researchers from AXA who took the floor, and that's amazing because the probability to work about the very technical work carried out by a researcher is very, very low. And I think this is critical because trust in science is eroding. And anti-science movements are on the rise. And so no, the very third, but go ahead, Philippe. So just to react to what you said, things that we do a lot at Veolia is putting researchers on the ground and looking at the short term. I use my researchers, and they know, sometimes they complain about it, but I send them to the ground to talk about what they know. So yes, they are passers of knowledge. And there's nothing better to convince somebody of the usefulness of a discovery than to solve a concrete problem. When we're talking about water reuse and you bring down risks around food security, or if you bring down prices or the analytical nonconformity, when you can address tangible indicators, then we make progress. But the researchers looking at the short-term solutions also have to work with those looking for long-term solutions. They all know that they're part of a community, and here I think that's one of our great strengths. But research has to be organized, and it has to be translated into concrete actions. Thank you very much. And a fourth hurdle, yes, getting out of the lab is essential. Working on the ground is essential. And we have projects around water contamination and water pollution. And we bring school kids out, they take pictures of the water to see what the color is. And so we really bring people to the ground, and we have them meet with our researchers. And we also carry out expeditions to universities. And when you see business leaders sitting in the university seats at Paris-Saclay, learning about invasive species, well, this is something we've been doing for 10 years. But not enough of us do this. We need more people doing it. And a third thing is the direct attack on scientists themselves. And this is largely underestimated because very often people, rather than attacking ideas, they attack the person behind the ideas. Let me give you an example that sheds a lot of light on it. There's a movement of people leaving the X platform. And there's an app to help you leave X with all of your followers and all of your content. And it wasn't created by 3 startups, it was created by CNRS researchers. And we thought, okay, why is the CNRS doing this? Well, because they feel like they're under attack. And another example, and these are researchers who went to Blue Sky, for example. And the first thing that the Russian misinformation efforts did was to create deep fakes of university professors, because Blue Sky is a social media which is considered more serious, more reliable, more scientific. So the first attack was against a professor from Aix-en-Provence, and it was a deep fake. And so the message to scientists is that there's nowhere to hide. They won't be safe anywhere, that they will be attacked. And yes, that can be a huge hurdle. Before we move on to solutions, you also want to say a word? So I am a great fan of the acquisition of true facts. But patients can't understand that data, so you also have to translate scientific data into something tangible. But what's important on the ground is to transform this into what it means for people on the ground and why it should be important to them. Because very often we look at mitigation approaches, we repair things, and yet we're not focusing on adaptation and resilience. And we really have to find a way to transform messaging to stop just fixing what's been broken. We need to anticipate much more. I'm sure you all remember the Sandy tempest in 2012 that hit Cuba, etc., and part of the U.S., New York. So Hurricane Sandy, they had to evacuate 6 hospitals, 10,000 patients, 31 health centers had to be evacuated. One of the largest hospitals in New York suffered $2 billion in damage. If they had anticipated, the $2 billion could have been spent on something else. So you have to draw conclusions from these things. It's important not just to repair what's been broken, but to really anticipate and to put money where that would help. So we're running out of time, so let's switch to the third part, which looks at solutions, and which will help us go further and hopefully to overcome some of these hurdles. So if you could tell us about some of the solutions. And we have two articles in our recent publication to broaden the specter. So Cyril Combe, who is in charge of the ILO, has a fascinating article on risks to workers. So S2SG said that prevention has to play an essential role, preventing risks from climate change. As the 187 Convention of the ILO lays out, only social dialogue makes it possible to hear from those who are on the front lines. And then another quote from Sandy Moore and Rita Colwell, who wrote a fascinating article on waterborne diseases in sub-Saharan Africa. So these are doctors in epidemiology and specialists in microbiology, who say that reinforcing climate resilience and prevention entails adopting a multifaceted strategy with community commitment, policies, research, and innovation. We have to reduce underlying vulnerabilities by improving access to safe drinking water and effective sanitation. And this shows that when you talk about solutions, you have to look at technology, at services, planification, and biomimetics, actually, is another part of the solution. So, Julia, maybe, so you talked about how important it is to fund research. Maybe you could talk about some of the solutions and some of the levers that we can action to overcome these hurdles. Well, the good news is that there are solutions. Solutions which often have been designed by researchers who had some crazy idea in a lab, and then it moves on to fundamental research, which is underfinanced in France. It's 0.3%, and the Draghi report says we should be at 3% of GDP. So research on the ground is the most concrete, but a lot of applied research starts with fundamental research in a lab. So the solutions will come from all over. We have to repair, we have to protect, we have to prevent and anticipate. We finance a lot of monitoring mechanisms. There's a lot of collaboration between public and private institutions. We seek to adapt our cities. We have a lot of researchers who contributed to the IBIS report and the new European Directive on air quality, and we're very proud when this research reaches a public policy level. So to take just one example, and this is an AXA chair that will be launching in 10 days, and we will encourage you to follow this, and this is the imbrication of these different worlds. When you talk about climate and health, well, let me give you two examples. First of all, so I've just come back from Grenoble, the University Space Center. I didn't realize that the Grenoble University sent satellites into space, and they're the size of this water bottle. It's crazy. And what they told me is that currently 56% of the data from the IPCC report comes from satellites. So we have to think about things like space and weather and solar eruptions, which can have an impact on our satellites and our knowledge of the world. And this damage would be much more than 2 billion euros. And so we talked about vaccines, RNA messenger vaccines, the anti-vax movement in the US. Objectively, vaccination has saved 154 million people over the past 50 years. This is an objective fact. And unfortunately, we may regress on these topics. We have a researcher from Argentina who said that RNA messenger vaccines that we pulled back out of a drawer for COVID, maybe I could use this for plants, to make plants more resistant to climate change. And in doing that, to ensure food security of countries who are going to be on the front lines of global warming. His name is Federico Ariel. He now has an AXA chair. He's 43. He's an incredible researcher. And he's going to be vaccinating plants tomorrow to be able to continue feeding the world population. And then if people have enough food, they won't have to leave. They won't have to migrate. Their environment will be healthier. And so when we talk about the nexus between climate and health, everything is linked, everything is interconnected, and you can identify things with a very concrete impact. And it's through chairs. There was also a chair on megafires, I believe, that you've supported. Well, this was in Crete. And very simply, we were talking about Australia. The pollution generated by megafires is 500,000 patients who will have respiratory problems every year. It's the same as malaria. So thank you very much. Now, Philippe, for solutions and Veolia's experience, maybe in terms of innovation, and also what's already been done and what could be taken further. Well, at a very practical level, we've done a lot. We've worked on radioactivity for Fukushima. We've done a lot of things upstream, and we have 20% of everything that is done in fundamental research, looking very far ahead, and then 80%, which is really on the ground. So the data revolution is something that's extremely important, and you can see that when you bring minds together with technicians to work on an old problem, but with new data, they achieve unbelievable results. We've developed for cities such as Nîmes and other cities in France, for a city in Denmark, systems to prevent and to detect illnesses. We can also foresee floods 3 days ahead to take actions, and we know how to empty reservoirs, which will be a problem. We can open up the floodgates on the network. We can do a number of things, and very concretely, just through calculations. It's quite advanced modeling. It's not just a calculator and Excel sheet, but we can do things, concrete things that go extremely far. For reusing of water globally or even at the level of a river basin. We do all this quite clearly. You work on the relationship with the population, for the population to feel protected and to understand, for them to understand what's going on. Well, nothing will work if the population's not on board. It's quite complicated. It's not always very visible investments or the infrastructures that have been set up to fight flooding. Now, does anyone know that in Nancy we've got a huge anti-flooding basin? Because in Nancy, the geological configuration is such that the storm goes 8 times around the city before it goes. We've done some ads for Australia. Now it's not sea. It doesn't last long. It's a very pleasant city, but it's a terrible place. It's a marsh basically. So you can walk around the city centre nowadays because we have this system for the prevention of flooding, which is quite incredible. But if you ask people in the street who knows about this anti-flood system, in other cities it's the same issue. It's different regions. When it rains in Bordeaux, for example, if there's no water evacuation system, you get, floods, 3-meter floods in the streets, just imagine. But there's been no floods in Bordeaux, because we tackled the issue. So some solutions work, but it can't be seen. So we need to explain things and make sure that people understand. When you talk about the matters of reviewing this plant because the water issues and so on and so forth, you need to explain why to the populations. You've got very simple indicators. The smell. This stinks. When you've got a horrible smell, you say, okay, we're going to work on that. It's quite tangible. In China, this is a major criteria. As you know, in China, mayors are judged by the central power, by the population's reactions, and bad smells next to people's homes is a criteria. It was a very important lever. Most of our Chinese customers are people who were,
reported because there was an issue due to smell. So the policy is, well, the state decides, municipalities, collectivities decides. We're talking about collectivity, we're talking about scientists, we're talking about elected representatives. Sandrine, where should this impulsion come from? Because we are almost at the Q&A session. So in this multi-actor scene you're describing, where should the boost come from? Who comes to mind first? Sandrine, I think it should be the industry. The industry has innovation capabilities. Scientists are going to give data to the industry, but the industry has capabilities to carry all this out, to innovate like nowhere else. So just like you, we can be real levers, we can be real activists to find solutions, and that's what's happening actually. We spent 1 hour presenting something, presenting a scene that's quite worrying for the years to come. But there's something that's changing. We're talking about these issues more and more, and we need to act. So the industry, the health industry, is mobilizing itself a lot, both for diagnoses. We identify levers, there's diagnoses, care at home, digital tools which are extremely important. Prevention is something that's also essential. Preventing natural disasters, preventing pollen allergies, as I said, preventing disease. We were talking about infectious disease, for example. You've all heard about bronchiolitis. We carried out a study last year. When you vaccinate newborns for bronchiolitis, all newborns in the UK got this anti-bronchiolitis vaccine. We reduced the health system's emissions quite significantly in terms of bronchiolitis treatments. Moreover, hospitals are no longer packed with children, babies who have bronchiolitis. So this matter of prevention is very important. But you need to convince parents that the children need a vaccine. So we're working on different injection methods for needles, acceptability, is a vaccine, what's in it, and so on and so forth. I mean, we've all heard about these issues in the COVID crisis. We're not going to go back to that, especially messenger RNA. So the community did mobilize itself. The pharmaceutical industry, the health industry are all working together to find solutions and bring them to people. We've got 5 pharmaceutical groups, for example, who funded a hub for the training of future health professionals, the ones who are at uni right now, on climate health issues. You need to change your behaviors. How can we treat all this, and so on and so forth. This is a large-scale project, and we recently created a partnership with an academy who trains for lifelong learning for doctors. So we've got this wake-up call, education, bringing solutions, and for these solutions to come from patient, we need to create this new boost. Just now, a quick boost. Where should the push come from? We didn't know each other before this roundtable, says Julia Dastorg, but we are all in agreement. That's the good news. There's this matter of alliances and coalitions. We do the same. We have an initiative, a coalition, to financially support researchers with a big insurance company. So we're going to support researchers on how we better rebuild after natural catastrophes, build back better. We want to do prevention on this. Alliances, coalitions, intersectorial and industrial coalitions. Well, all that's key. Thank you for being on stage here. We've all got things to say. So, Philippe, Seberac, I wanted to react to what you were saying. Julia, we're going to be attacked. Researchers are going to be attacked. Companies are attacked too. We're accused of doing things for profit, but our president is firmly attached to the social usefulness of a company. It's important to fight for this. We have a role that's useful to society. And I think we need to move forwards despite the difficulties. These coalitions, these concrete actions, they're our best advocate. We need to show the positive impact. Of course, we have our critics. Some people never back off, but others can be convinced. We need to bring solutions that work. We can't be destabilized, because these attempts to destabilize people, they're structured, they're well organized, they've got a very clear objective. And that's part of a hostility of a world. We're in a hostile world nowadays, unfortunately. Thank you very much. I think there are mics going around the room. So if you want to react, ask questions and so on, well, please give your name. Very quickly, say who you are, what you do, ask a question, and as we'd like your very brief contribution, because even though we are short of time, we can take as many pieces of info as possible. So I trust the Veolia teams who are going to hand a mic round, because I am dazzled by the lights and I can't see what's going on in a room, unfortunately. So please do react and tell us if we said a load of nonsense or if on the contrary, it was interesting. My name is François Namaver. I worked at AXA Climate. I like to hear your perspective on how vocational health can help. When you're at work, you rarely meet doctors or people who are in charge of HR when you're talking about the impacts of climate change. So what about vocational health, please? This is an excellent question. We can talk about this with Cyril Combe, who's not here today. What's frustrating is that we couldn't have 30 people on stage, but one of you like to react on vocational health. Maybe you could talk about this on a bridge with relationships between HR. Can you see interfaces setting themselves up? Well, our staff work on environmental issues, so they are exposed. When we had COVID, we protected our staff. It's our first reaction. It's a go-to reaction. It's something that was initiated by a president at the time, so we are extremely vigilant. We assess risk. Who's exposed first? Well, those who work on our sites, incinerators, on the roads, and so forth. So I think the HRs have integrated that so well that they don't even talk about it anymore. So it's a first reaction. So we work in our context and so forth. And Sandrine, well, I'm going to repeat what Philippe just said. In our groups, we have risk analyses at work, and we take on all the scenarios that can happen, including temperature rises. So there are things that happen. If this happens, what can we do? This is an issue in some countries, not everywhere, but this is something that happens in all countries, but it's treated by our health, safety and environment. Vocational takes its share and HR takes its part. This is a risk like other risks we have in our industries. So the concrete consequence of this nexus and the bridges we have, beyond getting interdisciplinary corporations, it's in how corporations work, because you all represent companies. But is there we can find new synergies, a more collaborative approach, people who do prospective research, HR, risk prevention, and so on and so forth. We need to work together. Just to react on one point we didn't mention, this subject, well, everyone is in charge of it. I work with Sanofi R&D on this issue. That's why scientific information is important, making people aware that there are diseases arriving. We need to prevent them, but we need to treat them too. So does the pharmaceutical have the tools to meet the needs of the future? Because, it doesn't work like that with a click of your fingers. Lots of roles in the company need to be made aware of the subjects to prepare for future and a world of the future. Just to add quickly, companies are being asked to have a larger social role than in the past. I used to be in charge of the AXA medical teams, and we'd say, give us face masks, vaccinations. I mean, nowadays, you are getting used to going to the vocational health center of your company to get your vaccines, but it's not something that was natural a few years ago. So more and more companies are going to be asked to do things for health at work. There's a question, Philippe Baecher, I'm in charge of industrial markets at Veolia. I had a question to talk about this idea of data and quality data to analyze and do a perspective for the future and raising awareness in the population. Actually, we do lots of prospective research on what's going to happen, but things are already happening, and I'd like to draw a parallel with this recent discussion I had with a group of doctors. They said, I haven't checked this, of course, but nowadays there's an 80% increase of cancers in the under 50 population. This is data from today. And when I ask, like anyone, any citizen would ask, why? What are the factors? What is the data? What's it due to? Bad eating habits? Or what is it, basically? Well, the 4 doctors around the table said, no idea. And that's what's happening nowadays. So we ought to work on a correlation we have nowadays that is actually impactful. No one wants to have a cancer before the age of 50 or even after the age of 50, but this can raise the population's awareness right away. This is a very good point, and there's correlations on what I was saying earlier on real data is crucial. The study I talked about earlier on really is weather conditions, the temperature going up by 2 degrees. This is the data from the past. What did it do to diseases? We've got real data. There are more there's more heart disease, and it impacts senior citizens, women, or people who live in urban environment or rural environment who live below the poverty thresholds. There's lots of criteria. There are more cancers, environmental issues, living conditions, smoking, not being a smoker. There's lots of data. Now, AI is going to help us do all these correlations, but we need to access data and for the data to be usable. And accessing data is complicated. In France, we have access to Météo France, and Météo France is quite confidential. We work with academics and scientists, and the results are quite amazing. But we need to make sure that we've got the right data. It's not the case in all countries who do similar studies in other countries, and we don't have access to the data. We need this because it's unpassed. When we say that the temperature's gone up by 2 degrees, well, what happens? The days it goes up. That's why the C4T Association, with the 40th largest cities in the world, focuses on this as well. As is the case with urban planning, they say that if the temperature goes up by 2 degrees here, I'm going to have +2 here. How do I make sure it doesn't go up by 2 degrees in this area? So you're right. We need to take the information from the past to be able to have forecasts, and forecasts will be very useful in terms of adaptation. I completely agree, says Philippe. We've worked with doctors on exposition, how we're exposed to risk. The more we know, the less we know. That's something that happens. People don't understand that. The more we know, the less we know. We now have investigation methods that are huge, but there's more and more questions that emerge. And we say, hey, we're not there yet. That's very difficult to manage. And I think that one of the reasons we work on the short term is we have questions that need an answer ASAP. Sometimes the answers can be slow in arriving. But we need to show that we're working on these issues. It's attitude, trust in the future. I think we'll be in the anthropocentric period for a long time. We're going to have to vaccinate our plants, modify our infrastructures. We'll continue modifying the planet. There's a matter of geoengineering that's going to be an issue in the near future. We need to do things. Things will do good stuff, yes, but ignorance and uncertainty can't stay there for too long. It needs to be a constant dialogue. We can't wait for every actor to find a solution. So we need to find an answer to all the questions. If you find an answer to all the solutions, Julia, would you like to react? Otherwise, we can take a third question if we're fine for time. Philippe Riquin. I'm in charge of the Sustainable Development Platform. Just comment on what you're saying on vocational help. We've taken adaptation of working conditions. We've got 10 pilot sites working on health, safety, and the Health and Safety Division really has taken issue from the point of view of protecting our workers. So we've got these matters of adaptations with the blue-collar workers. That's quite useful. That's good. And there's another experience in the north, because the heat waves were looked at in countries of the south, but we're looking at this for the countries of the north. And I think that Veolia is a trailblazer on this. We need to work with our staff. We need to take into account their health. Thank you. When you talk about these matters of changes and making this subject understandable to all is very important. Would someone else like to take the floor? Yes, good afternoon. My name is Emmanuel Bluon. I'm from Entreprise pour l'Environnement. Thank you for your discussions and your testimony. I'm going to read your report extremely carefully because it's very interesting. You talked about the matters of health and climate change, but you didn't talk about biodiversity much. Biodiversity, maintaining, preventing, human health as well. I'd like to know if it was a choice with a report or if we're less mature on this subject with organizations. How do you touch upon these subjects? I didn't see it was you because I'm dazzled by the lights, but thanks for being here, Emmanuel. So biodiversity, would you like to talk about that? Yes, we're trying. It's not easy. Climate change, well, a few years ago in New York last year, we said we're going to measure what's scope 1, 2, and 3, you know. We do correlations, but biodiversity is a lot more complicated to assess. We are certain there's a link. The loss of biodiversity has an impact on health. We can see that. We can see this in our diet. It's going to have an impact, that's for sure. But we can see an impact of a loss of biodiversity on immune systems. So we need to dig into this. We can't start with health, but the data was there. And we know how to work and bring solutions. If we don't understand the mechanisms for the activation of the immune system or the deactivation of the immune system because of a loss of biodiversity, we can't go much further. We'll just be completely off track and we'll waste time. And we can't afford to waste time. We're looking at this slowly but surely, but in truth, we're not mature yet. But we are looking at this issue. Philippe, would you like to react? Yes, Philippe. We've looked at quite a few things here. There are also difficulties. Some species are more important than others, and it's not the cutest ones. So the public doesn't have much sympathy. So we're very worried about the drop in the population in earthworms or insects. This is a huge issue. And the services of that the ecosphere carries out for us are not known by the public. And this is something that's very long-term, and we know that for everything that's got to do with the food industry, there's a major threat on about 50% of the activity. There's the risk of disappearances or major ecological presence on some of the plants we need to eat. So to get this message, in the US, there's 2 types of potatoes. In the Andes, there are 60 types of potatoes. And when you plant potatoes in the Andes, you plant about 12 species, and you just pick the ones that grow that year. So you are renewing the gene stock in the US. We have large potatoes, and when there's a crisis, we just put lots of pesticides, and then there's no potatoes. We'll just buy them from abroad.
So there's a real question of a reasonable management of resources. And currently, it's hard to put a price tag on a loss of biodiversity. The contribution of a wilderness to the gene pool is essential. And all of the services provided are essential as well, but very little known. And so here we need the long-term zoonoses as well. We need more research to prove that it's an emergency. We support about 20 projects focusing on biodiversity, and what is important is to be able to come and we'll bring these researchers to come and speak to you. In Saclay, there's a researcher looking at the collapse of biodiversity, specifically linked to invasive species. So worms, for example, brought in with people importing flowers, for example. But what he would need is to have more access to people, to border officials. So how do you create those ties? We work a lot with the World Wildlife Fund, and the idea is really to listen to these researchers. They now have things to tell us, and we have to get their message out there. And there's also the E-Lab barometer, supported by Veolia. 67% of all the world's inhabitants say that they're willing to pay extra and to change their behavior if it will contribute to protecting their own health and that of their loved ones. And so these data, because today you say, okay, we don't have enough data, all of you, and this data is absolutely vital to be able to make any progress. And people love house cats, for example, but when the cats go out, well, they kill birds. And you have no idea how many birds are killed. It has a huge impact. And the birds in cities, for example, have a very major role to play in eating insects. And so there's a snowball effect. I love cats, but if you do have cats, don't let them out too often because they eat birds, and this leads to a very concrete problem. The Danes have voted a law prohibiting people from letting their house cats out because there's a cascade effect. And when you observe nature around you, go and have a walk in the forest, keep your cats inside. And really, I go for a walk in the forest very often, on a regular basis, and studying biodiversity is fascinating and wonderful. Okay, one last question since we started a little late. Would somebody else like to take the floor? And then we will wind up.
Bonjour,
Thierry Trottois, Veolia Water. So I work at national level. And I had a question about biomimics. So are you carrying out any research? Are you funding research in biomimetics? Because I think that it's one of the solutions to solve quite a lot of problems, at least a source of inspiration. Philippe, would you like to say a word about this? Well, I'll just give one example. I have many membranes. Membranes that we use and our membrane bioreactors for water reuse are woven like spider webs. We use a liquid in a matrix. You pull on it and it goes through a variety of solutions. Then it dries, hardens, and this is what provides it with its characteristics. And we completely copied how spiders weave. And this is, yes, biomimetics being applied. And we had a lot of exchanges around this. With Danae, we try to make science speak within Veolia. Sometimes our managers aren't always as up-to-date as they should be, and so we recently had a conference of the Cebios, and yes, maybe you could say a word about this. Well, thank you very much for all of your questions. I won't go into my questions about Trump and the consequences on science and industry, but But thank you very much. And so your questions, the contributions, the information on research that you are financing is extremely useful. So we did have a conference on biomimetics, and it was fascinating. And we did raise the question about biodiversity. And we explored the idea of setting up a review on the question to say what the stakes, what the problems are. And this is, well, basically what you said. Really pushes us because it's so little known. And this will be very interesting to explore for research with academics and with the private sector. There's also the question of monetization, and so it is entirely possible that we might publish an issue of facts on this. It's very useful for Veolia. It's very little known, but people do know. So the collapse of biodiversity and its effects on human health as a driver, as well as our business. What are the effects? So thank you very, very much. Yes. Things for the future. Thank you very much, Dinah. Before I conclude, I would like to give you a chance to give us a final message. Well, okay, final. Obviously, nothing is final. Everything is wide open. But would you like to say a few words before we conclude? Maybe to insist on something that you really care about, to suggest a venue for future research? Well, I really like this notion of coalitions. Together, we're stronger. And we didn't know each other. Of course, we were very, very well prepped by you, but I think that there's a lot of convergence, and we do share a vision. And so I think all working together and pulling in the same direction is very important. And also, partnerships are one of our strategic axes. So that would be my final word. Let's seek the right partners and never lose time exploring, and always take the time we need to explore new ideas, to test them out. If they work, great. If they're not, well, at least we've learned something. So I completely believe in cooperation. Thank you very much. Julia? Thank you, Philippe? Yes, I think that we're all very well aligned, and thank you very much, and thank you for giving us this opportunity to raise awareness and to talk about the need to support science and to say that science is important. Thank you. Sandrine? Yeah, I pretty much wanted to say what Philippe just said, so what else can I add? Yeah, that's absolutely essential. Okay, we are aligned, and that's already very good news. So I would like to say two things very quickly. As I said earlier, we do a lot to repair situations, but we also have to tackle problems at the source. There's the question of biodiversity. So far, we're not doing very much, so we really have to act on the root causes of current problems to avoid future catastrophes. And then a second point, it's something we've mentioned, but we really have to act, take action. Thank you very much to the three of you, and thanks to all of you for being here today. Thanks to the Veolia Institute, which creates these spaces for reflection, for sharing knowledge. The most important is that this publication needs to be dynamic, and for that, you have to talk about it. The goal isn't just for us to be able to write great articles. We want it to inspire people. We want it to go out there. We want you to use it. It's accessible in French and in English. And so this opens a number of doors. I would like to say the contents of the articles are extremely rich and varied. We only scratched the surface here over an hour and a half, but in these articles you will see everything about mitigation, about climate migrations, about eco-anxiety, acceptability of the transformation, and it even talks about artificial intelligence. So all of this to say that I'm sure that it will occupy you all the way up until next Christmas. And of course, the Veolia Institute and Wavestone are here for those of you who would like to organize presentations or use it as a source for debates, panels, in a variety of formats with your collaborators, with your partners. We really want to bring it to life. because there's very little content actually on this nexus between climate, health, and the environment. So please use it, put it to use, and please let us know what your projects are, and we will contribute any way possible. Thank you very much for being here online as well, and see you very soon.